The crate arrived at the courthouse in a rainstorm, its wood swollen and darkened like something dredged from a drowned world. No one had asked for it. No one signed for it, and yet there it sat, leaning crooked against the whitewashed steps of the old building as if it had been dragged there by invisible hands. The sheriff ordered it opened, impatient at first, but that impatience dissolved into an unsteady silence the moment the lid came free. Inside lay a bundle wrapped in muslin, a coarse, time-stained shroud that gave off the faintest iron scent even in the wet morning air. When the cloth was peeled back, several courthouse workers turned away. Some whispered prayers, others dry-heaved into the rain. Within the folds lay the bones of a woman, small and fragile, but the fractures told their own unbearable story. They were old, older than anyone living in the town, and arranged with a deliberate care that felt ceremonial rather than accidental. At the bottom of the crate, tucked beneath the ribs like a mocking final ornament, was a rusted key attached to a tag bearing only 2 penciled words, Lower Cellar. That cellar had once belonged to a plantation house whose owners were spoken of in a hushed, instinctive way, as if merely saying their family name pulled at threads better left untouched. For generations, rumors clung to that estate like cobwebs, and the townspeople avoided passing it after sundown. They said doors slammed on windless nights. Lanterns flickered even when unlit. And in the overgrown side yard, beneath a live oak that split like a wounded jaw, people sometimes imagined they heard a woman humming, low and broken, until the wind changed and carried the sound away. No one had expected the past to claw its way back through the rain that morning, but history, when buried improperly, never stays buried. And the bones found in that crate would ignite an investigation into one of the most unsettling chapters of American darkness. What masters had done to the women they claimed to own. Hidden beneath floorboards and locked behind doors no outsider was meant to open. This story would reach back more than a century, to a family whose power shaped entire counties, whose wealth bought silence, and whose secrets festered underground in places where screams could not travel. Before we continue with the story of the Lowrey family and the chilling discovery that forced their legacy into the light, join our community of mystery lovers. Hit subscribe and tell us in the comments which state you're listening from. Your support helps us uncover more forgotten stories like this one. The year was 1847, deep in the plantation belt of the American South, where cotton was king and silence was currency. The land sprawled in every direction, rolling fields of white bolls, their fibers glistening under sun that felt more punitive than warm. Wagons creaked over muddy roads. Church bells tolled at sunrise and sunset, each clang echoing through the woods and across the flatland like a commandment. The air itself carried layers of life, the sweet rot of fallen magnolia petals, the copper tang of iron tools, the metallic whisper of chains, and, if one stood too still, the soft thrum of cicadas singing their indifferent song. People lived by rhythm set long before they were born. Dawn meant labor. Afternoon meant heat thick enough to blur the edges of buildings. Night meant caution, for in darkness the line between the living and the condemned grew thin. The South at this time wore 2 faces. The polite facade shown to visiting businessmen and ministers, and the hidden, pulsing machinery that kept its wealth alive. That machinery was human, bought, traded, punished, and catalogued like livestock. Planters boasted about their prosperity in public. Grand homes with columns wide as tree trunks, hand-carved staircases, lawns manicured by those who would never set foot on them for leisure. Yet inside these homes, behind the polite chatter over imported tea, secrets multiplied. Power was exercised not only through whips or ledgers, but through private rooms where authority went unquestioned and witnesses had no voice. Women enslaved in those households carried a double burden. They were laborers, cooks, caregivers, and without legal protection or recognition of their humanity, they were easy prey. Their stories, when recorded at all, were reduced to whispers in diaries or rumors exchanged in kitchens where the walls had ears. Many were taken into basements under the guise of punishment or house discipline, a phrase that sanitized cruelty for polite society. Those cellars, stone-lined and damp, became places where suffering was stored like grain. The Lowrey plantation stood about 12 miles west of Clinton, Mississippi. Locals called the land Lowrey Rise, though the terrain barely lifted above the surrounding marsh. The mansion itself rose 3 stories, with pale shutters and a balcony overlooking a drive lined with pecan trees. To an outsider, it radiated wealth and refinement, but to anyone who had worked there, even briefly, the house had a presence, a heaviness, as if the very timbers were listening. Travelers often remarked on the peculiar quiet that settled over the property. The birds around the estate seemed to perch silently, as though something disturbed the natural order. Even the wind seemed to avoid passing too close to the chimney stacks. Folks who lived nearby said the Lowreys carried a darkness in their blood, a cruelty that passed from father to son like an heirloom. The patriarch in 1847 was Josiah Lowrey, a man in his 50s with a bony face and eyes the color of rain clouds before a storm. His wealth came not from innovation but from inheritance, and he wielded it ruthlessly. He served as county treasurer, a deacon at the local church, and a regular host to visiting politicians. In public, he spoke with measured charm, quoting scripture and shaking hands with practiced warmth. Behind closed doors, his temper flared like a struck match. Those who worked in the big house learned quickly to read his footsteps, the slow, scraping drag that meant he had been drinking, or the sharp, clipped rhythm that meant he was furious. His wife, Miriam, seldom appeared at church socials. A frail woman with hands that trembled even in still moments, she drifted through rooms as though searching for something she'd lost long ago. "It's the air in that place," one neighbor murmured. "It's poisoned her." Whether she stayed because she was too frightened to leave, or because she knew her presence was the only shield, thin as parchment, between her husband and the people he controlled, no one could say. Outside the Lowrey estate, the country was inching toward crisis. Newspapers debated abolition with feverish anger. Churches split into factions. Paranoia seeped into conversations on street corners, in general stores, during Sunday dinners. The enslaved population outnumbered whites across much of Mississippi, fueling fears of rebellion among the elite. Legislators passed laws banning literacy, restricting gatherings, and authorizing brutal punishments for even imagined acts of disobedience. It was in this atmosphere, this simmering fear, this culture of silence, that the Lowrey basement gained its reputation. Some called it the lower cellar, others the pit, but no one spoke of it above a whisper. Only a handful of people had ever seen it. The estate overseer, a few trusted enforcers, and women who were never given the chance to speak afterward. Those who returned from that place walked differently. They flinched at footsteps. They avoided eye contact. Some vanished before sunrise, and their names went unrecorded, their fates buried under ledgers designed to mask loss. The Lowrey house staff learned to keep their eyes low and their questions to themselves. But children notice things adults pretend not to see. A stable-hand son once claimed he heard crying from beneath the floorboards while delivering feed in the pre-dawn hours. It weren't like regular crying, he said years later. Sounded like someone trying to sing through their tears. His father whipped him for speaking of it, terrified the story would reach the wrong ears. Visitors, too, sensed something unusual. A traveling preacher, upon staying overnight in the guest chambers, complained of a chill rising from the floor and a faint knocking that seemed to come from the walls. When he mentioned this to Josiah over breakfast, the landowner's spoon paused mid-air. "Old houses make old noises," Josiah replied softly, his smile thin. The preacher left before noon, refusing further hospitality. The community pretended not to see, not to hear, not to know. For to acknowledge what happened beneath that house would require confronting the sins not just of one man, but of a society built on the silent consent to those sins. Women enslaved there did not pass down their stories. They were not allowed to. Yet whispers persisted, traveling along river routes and kitchen corridors, retold by those who had fled or been sold. Stories of a master who locked women underground for days, sometimes weeks. Stories of rituals that made no sense in the daylight. Stories of a key, heavy iron, carved with strange notches, that only Josiah carried. When emancipation came years later, the Lowrey estate fell into decay. The family dwindled, their wealth dissipating like steam. But the basement remained, sealed by brick and iron. Locals avoided the place, saying it was cursed. Children dared each other to run up the steps and touch the front door, though most abandoned the challenge midway, overcome by a sudden dread that prickled their skin. By the turn of the 20th century, the house stood abandoned. Ivy clawed up the walls, wooden beams sagged, and the windows stared blankly like the eyes of something half dead. Yet the cellar stayed locked, untouched, as if whatever lay beneath had no interest in being forgotten. And then came the crate, delivered anonymously more than 100 years after the worst of the estate's history. The key inside it matched old records describing the cellar door. The bones belonged to someone who had lived during the Lowrey reign. Authorities tried to explain it away as a relic of the past, perhaps uncovered by erosion, perhaps carried from a forgotten grave. But the muslin wrapping was too careful, the delivery too deliberate. Someone had wanted the story reopened. Someone wanted the truth to be heard. In any story where the past rises like a storm cloud, there are certain figures whose shadows stretch longer than the rest. The Lowrey estate did not operate on land and stone alone. It ran on the wills of the people trapped within it, bound either by their own cruelty or by chains they never asked to wear. And when we speak of what happened beneath that house, we must start with the individuals who inhabited its rooms, the ones who gave it its breath, its noise, its secrets. The central figure in all the whispered accounts was Josiah Lowrey. To the outside world, he was a man of presence, tall enough that his silhouette filled doorways, thin enough that his frame always appeared angular, as if carved from raw timber. His jaw was sharp, his nose narrow, and his gray stone eyes held a perpetual expression of calculation. Observers often said he looked like he was doing sums in his head even while smiling. He spoke sparingly, but when he did, people leaned in. His voice had a low resonance, the kind that carried across a church floor without strain. "Every man has a place," he once told a visiting legislator while swirling a glass of bourbon near the hearth. "The good Lord made order for a reason. I merely uphold it." There was no raise in his tone, no flash of emotion, only a steady, controlled conviction that made his beliefs sound like scripture. Behind closed doors, though, the charm slipped. Those who worked in the house learned the danger of catching his attention on the wrong day. The cook, a broad-shouldered woman named Althea, used to warn newcomers quietly, "When his eyes go distant, like he's looking through you instead of at you, keep to the edges. Don't speak unless he asks." She said it softly, as though even the walls might betray her. Josiah's authority extended through every room, but his true dominion was the basement. He alone carried the cellar key, a heavy iron thing that hung from a ring at his belt. The slaves on the property said he touched it absent-mindedly, running his fingers along its notches the way a man might stroke a rosary. "It comforts him," one whispered, "or it reminds him." No one dared speculate what it reminded him of. Then there was his wife, Miriam, who drifted around him like a pale, quiet ghost. She had been raised in Georgia, the daughter of a merchant, known in her youth for her singing voice. But by the time she married Josiah, the vibrancy seemed to drain from her. Her hair, once thick and honey-colored, fell limp against her shoulders, and her eyes carried the faraway glaze of someone who rarely slept. The few neighbors who visited the house claimed you could always find Miriam sitting near a window with her hands folded in her lap, looking out at the pecan trees as though waiting for someone who never came. Her occasional small talk with visitors was halting and timid. "It's been a long season," she once murmured to the preacher's wife, her voice thin as paper. When asked about her health, she simply replied, "Some rooms in this house are colder than others." The way she said it, without emphasis, without explanation, left the visitor unsettled for days. Servants in the house whispered that Miriam sometimes woke up at night screaming, though the sound was muffled quickly, the way someone stifles a cry with both hands. They said she avoided the basement door entirely, crossing herself in a trembling motion whenever she passed it in the hallway. Whether she knew the truth of what happened below her feet or simply feared the possibilities, no one could say, but her dread was palpable, a living thing that followed her like a second shadow. Among the enslaved population, the woman whose name resurfaces most often in the stories connected to the lower cellar was Clara. She was said to be in her early 20s around the time the worst incidents occurred, with dark expressive eyes and hair braided tight against her scalp. Clara's mother had been purchased by the Lowreys years prior, and Clara had grown up in the house, moving between kitchen duties and mending work. People remembered her as soft-spoken but sharp-minded, a woman who listened more than she spoke. She had a quiet certainty about her movements, an instinct for predicting moods and stepping out of harm's way just before trouble struck. She could read a room like scripture, an elderly man once recalled long after emancipation. She knew who was angry before they did. Clara's voice was rarely heard beyond the kitchen, but on one occasion, recorded in fragments from those who later fled the estate, she confronted Miriam quietly after the mistress spilled a dish during one of her trembling spells. "Ma'am, let me help you," Clara said softly, reaching for the broken pottery. Miriam stepped back as though burned. "No," she whispered. "No, child. You shouldn't touch anything he's touched." Clara froze at the statement, recognizing the trembling fear beneath it. "He ain't here now," she said gently. "It's all right." Miriam only shook her head and murmured, "It's never all right in this house." That brief exchange would echo in the memories of those who heard it, a hint that Miriam understood far more about her husband's cruelties than she dared admit publicly. Another central figure at Lowrey Rise was the overseer, a man named Silas Grady. Where Josiah was calculating and cold, Silas was blunt and hot-tempered. His face held a permanent flush, his beard coarse and reddish, and his gait wide and swaggering. He kept a riding crop tucked under his arm even when he didn't need it, flicking it against his thigh in a way that set people on edge. Silas had a reputation for brutality, but even he avoided the basement. When asked by a fellow laborer why he never went down there, Silas responded sharply, "That place ain't my business. What happens under the master's feet stays under the master's feet." His voice had hardened when he said it, but there was a flicker, just a flicker, of unease in his eyes. He spoke to Josiah with a rough respect, though not affection. "The boss has his ways," he once muttered while sharpening a blade outside the stables. "Ain't ours to question." When pressed for clarification by a younger stable hand, Silas snapped, "Boy, you ask fewer questions, or you'll end up hearing things that ain't meant for you." The boy didn't ask again. Perhaps the most unexpected witness to the Lowrey estate's internal life was a child, Josiah's nephew William, who was sent to spend summers with the family after his parents died of fever. He was only 9 when he first arrived, carrying a small suitcase and clutching a pocket Bible. The staff described him as a thin, nervous boy with large eyes that took in everything. He wandered the halls quietly, often trailing behind Clara or Althea just to hear human voices that didn't carry threat. William later became a key figure in the testimony that would emerge decades after the house was abandoned. Though he rarely spoke, he absorbed details with the precision of someone living in constant fear of making the wrong move. Once, while Miriam attempted to feed him supper, William asked in a small voice, "Auntie, why doesn't the house sleep at night?" The question made her spoon freeze mid-air. "What do you mean, child?" she whispered. William stared at the floorboards. Sometimes I hear someone calling. Miriam stood abruptly and left the room, leaving her chair rocking behind her. These were the souls caught in the web of Lowrey Rise, some complicit, some terrified, some doomed to witness horrors they could never articulate. But among them all, one figure emerges with a prominence that refuses to fade, the unnamed woman whose bones were found in the rain-soaked crate. Records from the estate list a number of women whose names vanish abruptly from the plantation logs in the late 1840s. Some were noted as sold, others as deceased from fever or misadventure. But the body in the crate bore fractures inconsistent with illness and too deliberate to be accidental. Whoever she was, she had been important enough for someone, decades or even a century later, to package her remains with a message. Look again. Listen again. Do not allow this to disappear. In the fragments of oral history passed through generations, there is mention of a young woman who resisted Josiah in ways others did not or could not. A woman who avoided being alone with him, who arranged chores around his schedule, who helped the younger girls in the house stay invisible when his temper rose. The stories claim she had the kind of strength that frightened men who relied on obedience. When her name vanished from the plantation logs, the other women carried a silent grief for months. One elderly woman, interviewed late in life, recalled a single phrase whispered among the enslaved after the disappearance. He took her below. Those words carried weight, fear, and a trembling respect, as though the woman had faced something meant to break her, and had not broken easily. Whoever the bones belonged to, the crate was a summons from the dead, and the people who once walked the halls of Lowrey Rise, Josiah, Miriam, Clara, Silas, young William, and the unnamed woman who resisted, would soon emerge from the fog of history like silhouettes in a storm. Because when artifacts rise, so do the voices attached to them, and the Lowrey estate still had much to say. The earliest warnings did not arrive with screams or blood or anything so dramatic. They came quietly, like dampness creeping through old stone, slow at first, then unmistakable. Long before anyone outside the estate suspected what truly happened under the Lowrey house, an unease settled over the property that even the livestock seemed to sense. Horses balked near the rear entrance. Dogs refused to go near the cellar steps, planting their paws and growling low in their throats. A mule kicked its stall wall nightly until its legs bled, braying toward the main house with something like the terror. Clara noticed the shifts in sound first. The house had a rhythm she'd memorized since childhood. The morning creak of the pantry door, the midday rattle of the shutters, the soft clatter of Miriam's sewing table before supper. But one evening, as she scrubbed vegetables at the kitchen basin, she froze. The usual household noises felt muted, suppressed, and beneath the floorboards came a faint tapping, too deliberate to be settling wood and too uneven to be footsteps. "Althea," she whispered, not lifting her eyes. "You hear that?" The cook didn't look up from the dough she was kneading. "No, I don't," she said firmly. But her hand stiffened just slightly, and Clara knew she heard it too. That night, Clara lay awake on her thin straw mattress, listening. Now and then, the tapping returned, faint, rhythmic, followed by what might have been a low moan carried through stone. She pressed her palms over her ears, but the sounds seemed to seep through her anyway, as though the house itself was breathing. The next morning, Miriam appeared at breakfast pale and jittery, her fingers trembling so violently she could barely lift her teacup. Josiah's gaze flicked to her, then back to his plate. "You're unwell," he said flatly. "It was the wind," she replied quickly, eyes darting toward the floor. I imagined someone calling from below." Josiah's fork paused just long enough to make Althea's breath hitch. Then he continued eating, the scrape of metal against china louder than it should have been. "The house is old," he murmured. "Old houses speak in nonsense." But Clara, standing by the kitchen doorway, heard the warning beneath his words. This subject was closed. Later that week, a barrel of cornmeal stored near the cellar entrance burst open, the top blown off as though something had struck it from within. Silas Grady ordered 2 men to clean it, but when one approached the cellar door, he stumbled backward, shaking. "It's cold as grave water down there," he muttered. "Ain't natural." Silas cuffed him hard across the head. "Shut your damn mouth. Cold air settles low, that's all." Yet even Silas refused to go down himself. For the slaves who worked inside the house, the true alarm came when one of the younger girls, barely 14, refused to fetch firewood from the basement storage room. She stood rooted at the top of the stairs, eyes wide, shaking her head violently. "I can't," she whispered. "There's whisperin'. Someone's down there, Miss Clara. I heard him say my name." Clara knelt beside her, heart thudding. She wanted to dismiss it as childish fear, but the girl's terror was real. Too real. Clara placed a hand on her shoulder. "Hush now, you stay here." And she went herself, carrying a lantern with a trembling grip she hoped no one noticed. The cellar door moaned when she pushed it open. Air rushed up from the darkness, cold, clammy, smelling of stone and something faintly metallic. The lantern flame bent sideways, as if pulled. Clara descended the steps slowly, each one groaning under her weight. "Hello?" she called quietly, though she wasn't sure whom she expected to answer. No voice came, but a soft scrape echoed through the dark. She swept the lantern side to side, illuminating barrels, tools, sacks of grain. Everything appeared normal. And yet, the shadows seemed to gather unnaturally in the far left corner where an iron door sat half-concealed behind stacked crates. Clara stared at it. She had known it existed. Everyone in the house knew. But she had never seen it ajar. Tonight, it hung open by a hair. A sliver. Just wide enough for cold air to sigh through. She backed up the stairs slowly, never turning her back on the door. When she reached the hallway above, she shut the cellar door with careful hands and slid the bolt. She did not tell Althea what she saw. She did not tell the girl, but her pulse did not slow until sunrise. Around that time, the Lowrey property began losing things. Small items at first, spoons, scraps of cloth, a lantern wick, then larger things, a blanket, a wood-handled brush. A girl named Lottie disappeared for 2 full hours before reappearing with no memory of where she'd gone, only a dazed expression and bruises on her arms shaped like fingers. When Clara tried to speak to her, Lottie only whispered. It was dark, dark like breathing inside a wall. Within days, rumors began circulating among the enslaved. Someone was being held in the lower cellar again. The women exchanged fearful glances, but did not speak openly, not with Silas prowling, not with Josiah's temper flickering hotter each evening. Then came the night William, the young nephew, burst into the kitchen white as linen. "Aunt Miriam's crying again," he said breathless. "She said the house isn't alone under the house." Althea grabbed him firmly by the shoulders. "What exactly did she say, child?" William swallowed. "She said, he took another one down. I heard her pounding the walls." Clara felt something inside her go cold. The tapping, the scrape, the iron door, the missing blanket, Lottie's dazed eyes. She knew then that whatever was happening below them wasn't new. But it was happening again. And this time, it was growing bolder. Fear spreads differently on a plantation. In some places it hangs in the air like humidity, thick but ignorable. In others it skitters through rooms like a draft no one can find the source of. But at Lowrey Rise, fear seeped up from the ground itself, rising through floorboards and cracks in the plaster, until even the most hardened laborers moved with a nervous stiffness, as though walking above something alive. After the cellar incidents, conversations became tighter. People stopped lingering in doorways. Even laughter, rare to begin with, felt hollow. The slaves waited for explanations that never came, while the white staff pretended nothing had changed. But everyone felt the shift, sharp as a sudden winter can find the source of. But at Lowrey Rise, fear seeped up from the ground itself, rising through floorboards and cracks in the plaster, until even the most hardened laborers moved with a nervous stiffness, as though walking above something alive. After the cellar incidents, conversations became tighter. People stopped lingering in doorways. Even laughter, rare to begin with, felt hollow. The slaves waited for explanations that never came, while the white staff pretended nothing had changed. But everyone felt the shift, sharp as a sudden winter. It was William, the young nephew, who first spoke aloud what the adults dared not. One evening he crept into the kitchen while Clara scrubbed the large iron kettle. His steps were small, hesitant. "Clara," he whispered, "Aunt Miriam says Uncle Josiah's been hearing knocking again." Clara froze. "Or, he says it's rats, but Aunt Miriam says rats don't call people's names." Clara set the scrub brush down. "What names?" He opened his mouth, then shut it again, as though afraid to repeat the words. She said she heard a woman's voice, but Auntie says she never sees any new women in the house, none he'd speak of. The boy's fear radiated like heat. Clara crouched to eye level. "William, listen to me. Don't speak of that to no one else. You hear?" He nodded, but it was too late. His trembling expression said he already knew more than a child should, and the house had sharpened its claws around him. That same week, Miriam began wandering at night. Servants found her near the back staircase at 2 a.m, fingers pressed to the wall as if listening for something beneath. When confronted, she'd blink rapidly, confused, and insist she had only risen for water. But her slippers were wet with dew, not spilled drink, and once Clara found a smear of dirt on the hem of her nightgown, the color of soil from the cellar steps. The mistress was unraveling, thread by thread. By late spring, the tension reached the fields. The laborers became restless, glancing toward the house more often than toward their work. Even Silas Grady sensed something was shifting. He barked orders louder, swung his crop more readily, but his eyes kept drifting toward the main house with an unease he tried, and failed, to hide. One afternoon he caught Clara returning from the smokehouse and stopped her abruptly. "You been near the cellar lately?" he demanded. Her heart lurched, but she kept her voice steady. "Only for firewood." Silas leaned in, breath thick with whiskey. "If Josiah tells you to bring someone down there, you don't ask questions, you don't look around, you do it quick and come right back up. You got that?" Clara forced herself not to take a step back. "I ain't bringing nobody nowhere without knowing why." Silas's jaw tightened. "You think you're brave," he hissed, "but brave ones make the loudest echoes down there." He stepped aside with a rough grunt. "You walk careful, girl." That night Clara cried quietly in the laundry shed, though no one heard but the cicadas. News of strange happenings at Lowrey Rise traveled beyond the property. A field hand who'd been sold to a neighboring estate muttered about voices under the floor. A merchant passing through Clinton overheard talk in the general store about another woman gone missing at the Lowrey place. These rumors reached Father Gideon, the local priest, who had long harbored suspicions about Josiah's temper and his wife's ghostly demeanor. Father Gideon visited the estate under the guise of offering pastoral support. Josiah greeted him with polite stiffness. "We've missed you at service," the priest said as he stepped inside. Josiah's smile was brittle. The Lord forgives absence when a man's house demands attention. Father Gideon's eye swept the hallway, noting the shuttered windows despite the bright day. "Is everything well in your home?" "My home," Josiah replied, "is exactly as the Lord intends." Before the priest could respond, Miriam appeared at the top of the stairs. She gripped the banister tightly, knuckles white. "Father," she whispered, "have you ever—" "Miriam," Josiah interrupted sharply. "Go back to your room." Her lips trembled. "But—" "Now." She retreated silently, and Father Gideon watched her go with a troubled stare. "Your wife seems distressed," he said. "My wife," Josiah murmured, "imagines things when she grows idle." The priest stepped closer, lowering his voice. "If someone in this house is being harmed, I am bound to respond." Josiah's expression darkened. "Be careful, Father. Accusations are fire, and fire tends to burn the man who lights it." The priest left soon after, deeply unsettled. Meanwhile, the enslaved women continued losing sleep. Every night brought new sounds, muffled sobbing, scraping against stone, or a faint melodic hum that no one could trace. Some nights it was silent. Other nights, the air felt charged, like the moment before a lightning strike. Lottie, the girl who had vanished, worsened. She woke screaming some nights, insisting someone had whispered in her ear while she slept. "She said she was cold," Lottie sobbed. "She said she couldn't see anymore." Clara held her tightly. "Who said that?" But the girl only cried harder. Days later, Lottie tried to flee the estate, running barefoot toward the tree line at dawn. Josiah caught her before she made it 50 yards. Witnesses said his face looked carved from stone. "You think you can leave this property?" he said quietly. "After what you know." She shook violently, unable to answer. Josiah gripped her chin. "If you run, child, the forest will not keep you. It listens to me." Clara watched from the fields, helpless and shaking. Lottie returned to work the next day silent, eyes vacant, the bruise on her cheek shaped like a hand. Then there was the storm. One July evening, thunder rolled across the horizon, deep and resonant. Rain lashed the house. Wind bent the trees like bowing servants. Inside the kitchen, the slaves huddled close to the dry hearth. Every clap of thunder rattled the windows. During a lull, a sound rose from the floorboards beneath Clara's feet, a low moan, long and trembling, too human to mistake. Her spoon stopped mid-air. Althea gasped. Even Silas, passing through the hall, froze. The moan came again, then fists, pounding. 3 slow knocks. Then a voice. "Help!" Clara staggered backward. "Lord have mercy," she whispered. "Someone's down there." Silas spun on her, face pale with fury. "You heard nothing." "Silas, you heard nothing?" He stormed out, but the panic in his eyes betrayed him. That night he slept in the stables, refusing to remain inside the house. By morning, the cellar door had been bolted from the outside twice over. But the knocking did not stop. It came at odd hours, sometimes dawn, sometimes deep night, always the same pace. 3 knocks, silence. 3 knocks, silence, like someone signaling, waiting. Clara tried to track when Josiah left the house. She realized the knocking grew louder when he was gone and quieter when he returned. It was as if whoever was below feared him. Or worse, expected him. Weeks passed and the atmosphere thickened. Even the air seemed heavier. The night insects grew quiet. Farmhands complained of nightmares. One claimed he saw a woman standing in the orchard at sunrise, a figure in a torn dress, pointing toward the house. But when he blinked, she vanished. "Heat plays tricks," Silas insisted, but his voice quivered. Miriam grew increasingly erratic. She began avoiding meals, muttering fragments of prayer under her breath. One evening, Clara found her crouched in a hallway corner, fingers pressed over her ears. "He's going to bring another down," Miriam whispered. "I heard him last night, telling the walls to be patient." Clara's breath caught. "Miss Miriam, is somebody alive down there?" The mistress slowly raised her eyes. They were red-rimmed, hollow. Alive? She repeated. Alive isn't the right word. Her voice dropped to a trembling whisper. Not after the walls get hold of them? Before Clara could push further, Josiah's footsteps echoed down the hall, and Miriam scurried away like a frightened bird. The next day, William approached Clara, clutching a folded scrap of paper. I found this, he whispered, under the guest room rug. I think you should see it. Clara hesitated. Boy, if someone catches you... No one saw, he insisted. Please. She unfolded the paper. The handwriting was small, shaky. He took her below. She begged for the light. She begged for God, but God did not hear under the stone. If I cannot leave, I will leave word. There was no name, no date, just a final line. If anyone finds this, tell the others, the walls remember. Clara felt her knees weaken. Who wrote this? William shook his head. I don't know, but it weren't Aunt Miriam's writing, and Uncle Josiah doesn't hide things under rugs. Clara folded the note tightly. Give this to no one else, not even Althea. Hide it. William swallowed hard. Do you think the woman, the one in the walls, do you think she's still alive? Clara didn't answer. She couldn't. But the knocking that night felt slower, weaker, as though whoever or whatever was below had grown tired. Then came the night Josiah returned home late. Clara heard the front door slam, heard him curse under his breath, heard his boots cross the floor with a harsh, angry rhythm. But for the first time in weeks, the knocking stopped. Entirely. Silence stretched through the house like a drawn-out breath. Clara lay awake in dread until dawn, pressing her palms against her ears, waiting for any sign of life beneath the house. None came. In the following days, people avoided the cellar door altogether. Even Silas refused to go near it. Birds stopped landing on the roof. Dogs howled at empty air. Lottie slept with her eyes open. And Clara, lying awake in the heat-dark Sundays of July, wondered if the silence was mercy, or if silence meant something far worse. What do you think guilty souls cursed by God, or victims of madness? Tell us below. Your theories matter here. Silence lingered at Lowrey Rise like a veil. Not a peaceful silence, but the kind that circulates before a storm breaks thick, oppressive, expectant. Clara felt it every time she crossed the hallway above the cellar door. The air seemed denser there. Her breath always came shorter. Her skin prickled, and she had the uncanny sensation of being watched from beneath her feet. Something was waiting. It was on an August evening, the kind where the heat refuses to die even after sunset, that the truth fully uncoiled. Josiah had been gone all afternoon. No one knew where. When he returned, his clothes were dusted with dry earth and his boots caked in mud, even though the roads had been bone dry for weeks. Clara saw him cross the foyer with an expression she could only describe as satisfied. Not joyful, not calm, but satisfied, like a man who'd finished a task he'd been dreading. He went straight to the cellar. She heard the key scrape in the lock, heard the iron door groan open, heard his boots descend. But this time, no knocking answered him, only that suffocating quiet. Then, moments later, she heard something that made her blood ice cold. He spoke. Not to himself, not threatening someone. He spoke the way a man speaks when addressing someone he respects. Or fears. It's done, he murmured. You have no more claims here. The words floated up through the floorboards, faint but clear. Clara pressed her hand over her mouth to keep from gasping. She crouched low, ear near the boards. There was no reply, not spoken, not breathed, but Josiah paused, listening, as though he heard something responding. And Clara could swear the house pulsed once under her feet, like stone inhaling. When Josiah finally climbed the stairs, his boots were dragging, his breath uneven. As he reached the top, he froze, sensing someone near. Clara ducked behind the doorframe, holding her breath until her lungs burned. Josiah exhaled through his nose, then locked the cellar door again and left without a word. That night, Miriam broke. Clara found her in the upstairs hallway past midnight, kneeling on the floor, sobbing into her hands. When Clara reached for her, Miriam seized her wrists with surprising strength. "Do you hear it?" she whispered. Clara listened. "I hear nothing." "Exactly," Miriam said, eyes wide and hollow. "Nothing, no crying, no knocking, no begging. He says it's over, but the silence is worse. It means the house is waiting for the next." Clara swallowed hard. "Who was down there, miss?" Miriam didn't answer. Instead, she looked past Clara toward the stairs leading to the cellar door. "Some souls," she murmured, "do not die cleanly. They cling to every stone that witnessed their suffering, and that place is made of nothing else." Lightning flashed outside the window, illuminating her trembling face. For a moment, Clara saw something feral in her eyes, terror. Yes, but also an ancient grief. "I tried to stop him once," Miriam whispered. "Long ago, I unlocked the door when he wasn't home. I thought I could free her." Her voice cracked, but she wouldn't come out. Clara felt a cold shiver run through her. "Wouldn't?" Miriam nodded slowly. "She said she couldn't leave. She said the dark had taken her name." A gust of wind rattled the shutters. Miriam startled like a frightened animal. "He found out," she continued. "I don't know how. He knows every sound in this house. He sealed it with brick. I begged him to let her go. I told him she'd die if she stayed." Miriam covered her face. "He said death was cleaner than the world." Clara's voice trembled. "What happened to her?" Miriam lowered her hands. "Child, if I tried to tell you, you'd think me mad." Clara squeezed her hand. "Try me." Miriam opened her mouth, but just then, both women heard it. A sound. Faint. Wet. Like a slow dragging across stone. Clara's heart hammered. "Miss Miriam." The mistress clutched her arm. "It shouldn't be moving. He said it was done." Clara wanted to run, but something rooted her to the spot, and beneath her feet the dragging sound grew louder, closer, as though something was pulling itself across the floor of the lower cellar. Then the unmistakable metallic rasp of an iron hinge shifting. The inner door. The one behind the crates. Clara stepped backward, trembling so hard her knees nearly buckled. "Miss Miriam," she whispered, "we need to wake the others." But Miriam shook her head violently. "No, no, no. If you wake the house, it listens. It listens to every footstep." Another sound rose from below, a low, drawn-out exhale. Not human, but shaped like the memory of a voice. Clara clapped a hand over her mouth. "Lord, protect us," she breathed. Miriam turned slowly toward the stairs, her face drained of all color. "We're too late." Just then, the front door banged open. Silas Grady stumbled inside, soaking wet with sweat despite the night air. "Where's the master?" he barked. "I need to speak with him now." Clara stepped forward. "What's wrong?" Silas's voice shook. "One of the field hands found something by the old well. A hole, fresh dug, big enough to bury." He stopped, eyes flicking toward Miriam. "I ain't saying more." Miriam collapsed against the wall with a broken sob. Clara felt her legs trembling. "Silas, what did he bury?" Silas stared at the floor. "Something wrapped in cloth, something shaped like a person, but I ain't digging it up without the sheriff. I ain't touching anything from this cursed house." As he spoke, thunder cracked outside, and from the cellar came that dragging sound again. Silas stiffened. "What in God's name was that?" Clara whispered. It wasn't God. The dragging stopped. Then 3 slow knocks. Clara screamed. Silas lunged for the cellar door, fumbling with the bolt. Miriam grabbed his arm. Don't open it. Silas yanked free. If something's down there, I ain't leaving it. But before he could pull the door wide, a chill swept through the house, cold enough to frost the glass of the hallway lamp. Clara felt her breath crystallize in her throat. Silas froze with his hand on the latch. What? He began. But he didn't finish. Because from the other side of the door, a whisper slipped through the crack under the wood. Her name. Clara's name. Drawn out. Faint, but unmistakable. Her blood stilled. Silas dropped his hand like he'd been burned. No, he whispered. No, I didn't hear that. I didn't hear. But he had. All 3 of them had. Clara staggered backward, shaking uncontrollably. She's calling me, she choked. Lord help me, she's calling me. Miriam gripped Clara's shoulders. She doesn't want you. She wants witness. Silas turned to Miriam, panicked. Mistress, what's down there? What did he do? Miriam stared at him with a hollow expression. He locked her below, in the house, took something from her that belonged only to God. Silas crossed himself in shaking motions. I'm fetching the sheriff. He ran out into the storm. Miriam took Clara's face in her hands. Child, she whispered, whatever happens, do not answer if she calls again. But Clara could barely hear her. She was staring at the cellar door, where dust trembled on the wood, as though something beneath it was breathing, slow and heavy. The house had awakened. And the truth of the lower cellar, the truth buried by money, fear, and generations of silence, was rising like floodwater. Because the woman who had died beneath that house had not died quietly. And she did not intend to remain quiet now. If you stood in that room, the voice of the narrator would ask, would you call it crime or sacrifice? Leave your answer. Silas Grady ran through the storm as if chased by the devil himself. By dawn, he'd reached the sheriff's office in Clinton, drenched, wild-eyed, babbling about voices under the floor and a body buried near the Lowrey well. Sheriff Alden Brewer, a man so rooted in procedure he was nearly stone himself, at first dismissed Silas as drunk or delirious, but the overseer's terror wasn't the kind that could be feigned. His hands shook. His voice cracked, and when he finally whispered, "Her bones ain't staying quiet," the sheriff felt a chill ripple down his spine. By mid-morning, a small search party rode toward the Lowrey estate under a sky washed gray after the storm. As they approached the house, the first thing they noticed was the silence, not the peaceful kind, but the expectant hush that follows a cry no one dares answer. Inside, Clara sat at the kitchen table, wrapped in a blanket. Her eyes were swollen, her breath unsteady, but she remained lucid enough to recount the knocking, the dragging, the whispering of her name. Sheriff Brewer listened with tight-lipped skepticism, but each detail chipped away at his disbelief. Upstairs, Miriam Lowrey paced her room, whispering prayers through trembling fingers. When the sheriff questioned her, she answered only one thing with clarity. "Check the cellar," she said, "but do not go alone." That advice the sheriff ignored. He ordered the bolt removed from the cellar door. When the hinges groaned open, cold air surged out like a held breath released. The men descended step by cautious step, lanterns lifting shadows in long, nervous arcs. The cellar was damp, stone-lined, ordinary at first glance. Barrels, tools, the usual trappings of storage. But farther in, half hidden behind crates, they found the inner iron door. Brewer paused before it. The iron was old but preserved, as though touched often. The latch bore scratches, deep ones, some horizontal, many vertical, marks of fingernails, or tools. The sheriff refused to speculate aloud. "Open it," he ordered. Two men forced the hinges, which screamed in protest as if the door itself didn't want to move. Behind it lay a small chamber only 6 or 7 feet across, a room with no ventilation, no bedding, no light, just stone walls slick with moisture and a rusted chain bolted to the floor. Someone whispered a curse under his breath. But the sheriff knelt, lantern raised high, and there, in the dust, he found the faint impression of fabric, a muslin scrap stuck beneath a stone tile, and, embedded in the grout by the far wall, something even more chilling, a fingernail. He stood abruptly, face ashen. "We seal this place," he said. "Now." When they searched the grounds near the old well, Silas's account proved grimly accurate. The earth had been freshly disturbed. When the soil was removed, the men revealed a trench empty, save for faint traces of fabric fibers flattened into the dirt. Someone had dug there. Someone had laid a body-shaped bundle in the ground. And someone had removed it before the sheriff arrived. The search party exchanged uneasy glances. The sheriff rode back to the house with a storm building on his face. Josiah Lowrey was nowhere to be found. News spread quickly. By sunset, neighbors gathered at the property line, whispering in tight clusters. Some insisted the Lowreys had been cursed for sins long denied. Others muttered about madness, aggravated by drink or stress. A few claimed they had always known something was wrong at that estate, the way birds avoided the windows, the way children cried, passing its gates. Father Gideon arrived at dusk and demanded to see the cellar. Sheriff Brewer refused. "You'll read about it in my report." "There are things," the priest replied quietly, "that paper cannot hold." He prayed at the threshold instead. As word of the investigation seeped beyond county lines, reporters arrived from Jackson, even from New Orleans. They probed the story, digging into plantation ledgers, interviewing former hands who had long since fled. What emerged was not a single crime, but a lattice of disappearances spanning years, names stricken from logs, purchases recorded without corresponding deaths, punishments noted but never explained. Each testimony gathered caused the sheriff's pile of evidence to grow heavier. The bones from the crate were examined by a local doctor, Dr. Horace Bellamy, stern and pragmatic. His findings were careful, but his conclusion firm. The fractures were consistent with prolonged abuse. The remains belonged to a woman roughly 20 to 25 years old. No signs of burial, long exposure to damp, and ligature wear along the wrists. The investigation had to acknowledge what whispers always hinted. The Lowrey cellar was no punishment room. It was a holding place, possibly for more than one victim. When this reached the newspapers, public fear bloomed into outrage. Communities that once revered the Lowrey name spit it out like something sour. Church congregations demanded accountability. Legislators quietly distanced themselves from the family. Former slaves across Mississippi came forward with fragments of stories about other plantations where similar rooms existed. Dark enclosures used to break the will of the disobedient, the outspoken, the unlucky. But none spoke of circumstances as prolonged or as secretive as the Lowrey case. The law, however, struggled. Much of the evidence was old. The primary suspect, Josiah Lowrey, had vanished. The witnesses were formerly enslaved people, whose words courts of that era devalued. The physical remains were without identity. Yet the sheriff pressed forward. Arrest warrants were issued, notices posted, search parties organized, rivers dragged. All of Mississippi felt as though it were turning over stones better left untouched and finding rot beneath every one. Miriam Lowrey fell ill during this time. Whether from guilt, grief, or the sheer horror of truth clawing its way to daylight, no one knew. She was moved to her sister's home in Georgia, where she died 3 months later. At her bedside, she whispered a final phrase, overheard by a nurse. I tried to let her out. God forgive me, but she had no name left. Clara was interviewed multiple times, but her testimony was muddled by fear and exhaustion. She spoke of sounds, shadows, knocking, crying. But the sheriff needed dates, names, verifiable details. Clara had only lived sensations: the house breathing, the cellar shifting, the voice calling her, none of which law could acknowledge. Still, Sheriff Brewer recorded every word. The Lowrey estate was seized, the cellar sealed with brick and mortar, a sign posted, "Entry prohibited by order of the county." But long after the law had closed its books, the people did not forget. Children grew up hearing stories of the woman who was buried twice, once under the stone, once by silence. Travelers avoided Lowrey Rise. Some claimed that on certain nights the cellar door rattled, even though the hinges had been removed. Others insisted they heard a low tapping carried through the ground itself. 3 knocks. Always 3. And the more newspapers published, the more the public asked questions broader, heavier, more damning than one plantation alone. What crimes had America buried beneath its own floorboards? How many voices had been sealed in stone? How many stories whispered only when the world finally quieted enough to hear them? The Lowrey case left a stain on Mississippi's historical memory, a symbol of cruelty hidden by power, of justice too late to save the living or the dead. But the story was not finished. Because the final report, Sheriff Brewer's privately kept ledger, only uncovered decades later, contained one line that still chills historians today. The inner cellar was empty, but the walls were warm. History has a strange way of echoing. Long after the beams of the Lowrey house collapsed, long after the cellar was filled and the papers filed away, people still spoke of the place in lowered voices, not because of ghosts, but because of memory. The kind of memory that seeps into the soil when suffering is pushed out of sight. The kind that refuses to stay buried, no matter how many bricks are laid over it. Even now, scholars debate whether the knocking was imagined, whether fear distorted truth, or whether the past was simply unwilling to die quietly. But one question remains larger than any single theory. What else lies sealed beneath America's forgotten houses, its quiet farms, its aging foundations? How many stories still breathe under the floorboards? So what do you believe? Was this truth unveiled, or was it buried to protect the powerful? Write your theory in the comments, and if you want us to keep digging into America's darkest history, like this video and subscribe for next week's story.